The alarm screamed through the steel corridors like a warning shot. Lights flickered above the cell blocks as guards scrambled, radios crackling with static and tension. Inmate 4728, known across the state penitentiary as Razor, was on the move, and anyone who had survived a single day in this hellish complex knew the storm was coming. A few seconds ago, a guard had opened the wrong door, a routine mistake that would have deadly consequences. Now, Razor's shadow stretched across the hallways, a predator in sweat-stained orange, eyes like shards of ice, calculating, merciless. The penitentiary was enormous, a fortress of gray stone and metal fencing that held over 1,000 souls in varying degrees of desperation and menace. Razor's reputation wasn't earned overnight. It was built on fear, dominance, and acts so violent that even hardened inmates hesitated to speak his name. He moved silently, his boots barely clanging against the polished concrete, yet the prisoners knew his approach. Whispers stopped mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward the corners, and the usual scuffles of the morning yard ceased. He was coming, and everyone knew someone, or something, was about to break. This wasn't just another fight in prison. Razor didn't pick fights for sport. He picked targets for a reason, and the reason was always terrifyingly clear. He wanted control. Control of territory, control of perception, control of fear. The guards were already strategizing, 2 men flanking the hallway, radios pressed against their ears, calling for backup, trying to anticipate the next move of a man who had evaded restraint for years. Razor paused outside a cell, reading the tension like an open book. Inmates cowered, some silently mouthing prayers, others trying to shrink into shadows that couldn't protect them. One man had crossed Razor days ago, had spoken disrespect in the wrong tone, and now the predator had come for retribution. There would be no negotiation. No mercy. Prison, in that moment, wasn't a structured system, it was Razor's hunting ground. Inside the control room, monitors flickered. Security footage caught Razor pacing. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't reactive. He was methodical. His hands flexed, almost testing the air. The guards knew the man could snap at any moment, yet he hadn't. He was making them wait. Razor's power wasn't just in the fists or weapons he could access. It was psychological, a deliberate manipulation of fear that rippled through the prison like an electric current. Then came the first sound that confirmed every nightmare whispered in the corners, the shattering of glass. Razor had struck a window, not to escape, but to signal dominance, an announcement that the predator was active and the rules had changed. Guards moved forward, cautiously, eyes scanning, weapons raised. But Razor wasn't the type to be caught in plain sight. He vanished into a cluster of shadows, his movements almost invisible in the dim light, leaving a trail of chaos that the prison staff would struggle to contain for hours. Meanwhile, in another block, whispers traveled faster than guards could react. Razor had a history of preying on informants, weak inmates, anyone he suspected of disloyalty. Rumors claimed he had orchestrated fights, hidden contraband, and even manipulated alliances between gangs to his favor. The prison was a chessboard, and Razor always played 10 moves ahead. Yet the origins of his violence weren't entirely known. Some said a childhood forged in trauma. Others whispered stories of betrayal, loss, and rage turned outward. The truth was tangled, but the result was undeniable. Razor was a terror, and survival in his proximity required strategy or luck. The first confrontation began in the laundry room, a confined space with tables, washers, and stacks of dirty uniforms. Razor's intended target, a younger inmate named Lenny, froze as the door creaked behind him. Razor stepped forward, slow, deliberate, circling the room like a predator stalking a trapped prey. Lenny's heart raced, every rational thought screamed to run, yet escape was impossible. The guards, positioned at a distance, shouted commands, but Razor ignored them. He thrived in these moments of tension, feeding on fear before striking. Suddenly, Lenny made a mistake. He stepped backward into a table. Razor's movement snapped into speed, his hand grabbing a pipe. The first blow shattered a stack of laundry carts against the wall. Chaos erupted. Inmates screamed. Guards moved in, attempting containment, but Razor was unpredictable, swinging, dodging, exploiting every weakness in the layout. One guard was struck with the blunt end of the pipe, crashing against the wall. Another tripped over scattered uniforms, barely avoiding Razor's grasp. Within moments, the laundry room had become a battlefield, each moment weighted with life-or-death consequences. What made Razor terrifying wasn't just his physical prowess. It was his calculation. Every move had a purpose. Every strike carried the message, "This is my domain, and you exist at my mercy." Inmates who had survived brawls with multiple prisoners simultaneously knew Razor's battles were different. He didn't fight to win in the traditional sense. He fought to dominate, to humiliate, to prove the hierarchy was his. Meanwhile, in the security office, footage showed something even more disturbing. Razor wasn't alone in thought. He had manipulated a network of alliances, a system of fear that extended beyond immediate violence. Certain inmates obeyed unspoken orders, moving or standing in ways that facilitated Razor's control. It was subtle, invisible to untrained eyes, yet clear to anyone studying the patterns. Razor wasn't merely a violent man. He was a strategist, a psychological predator who understood the anatomy of fear in the confined prison ecosystem. As the brawl escalated, guards finally deployed containment tactics. Pepper spray, physical restraint teams, and emergency lockdown procedures were initiated. Razor fought, but with every move he seemed almost to anticipate the countermeasures. He twisted, ducked, and redirected energy, maintaining dominance even as the guards forced him toward a holding cell. The room was littered with debris, the air thick with panic, the echoes of shouts reverberating down the steel hallways. Finally, Razor was secured, but the aftermath was catastrophic. Inmates whispered about the man who had controlled the chaos, the one who had dominated the confrontation without fully breaking a sweat. Guards shook their heads, both relieved and apprehensive. Razor was behind a reinforced door, yet the tension didn't dissipate. Fear lingered. Respect mingled with terror. Survival in this environment required constant vigilance, and Razor's shadow loomed over every block, every corridor, every whispered conversation. Later that night, prison investigators reviewed footage, searching for anomalies. It was then that something shocking emerged. Razor had been plotting further chaos for weeks. Surveillance caught him passing notes, arranging interactions, testing loyalties. This wasn't a one-off incident. This was orchestration, a deliberate escalation designed to send a message far beyond a single fight. The revelation hit harder than any physical attack. Razor wasn't just violent, he was methodical, patient, and terrifyingly intelligent. His motivations weren't rooted in impulse alone. They were strategic, designed to establish unchallengeable authority and instill a fear so profound it reshaped the behavior of every inmate in the facility. And then, in the final moments of review, an even darker detail appeared. Hidden in a maintenance closet, investigators discovered evidence of an improvised weapon cache, pipes, sharpened objects, and other tools fashioned for combat. The discovery confirmed what had long been suspected. Razor was planning for the long game. He was not only a threat to the immediate population but a living embodiment of chaos within a controlled system. The staff realized, with growing dread, that containment had been temporary. Razor's influence stretched further than anyone had calculated. The lines between prisoner and predator had blurred entirely. And in the dim light of the prison, as inmates whispered and guards prepared for the next confrontation, a chilling truth settled over the facility. Razor's reign wasn't confined to a single day. It was an ongoing siege, psychological and physical, with a strategist at its center. But when investigators opened a hidden maintenance panel, long thought and used, they found documents, notes, and schematics outlining relationships, alliances, and plans that went far beyond the known incidents. What they found inside wasn't just evidence of planning, it was a map of power and terror, and it changed everything about how the prison understood the man inside. The next morning, Federal Penitentiary Unit 3 awoke to an undercurrent of tension that even the guards could feel. Razor's shadow had stretched far beyond the laundry room brawl. He had spent the night orchestrating his influence, making subtle phone calls through contraband lines, leaving coded notes for trusted inmates, and signaling loyalty through gestures only insiders recognized. The facility wasn't just a prison anymore, it was a chessboard, and Razor was already 3 moves ahead. Inmates who had once scoffed at his reputation now whispered warnings, moving more carefully, obeying the invisible rules of fear he had set. Even the most hardened criminals learned to tilt their heads when Razor passed, a silent acknowledgement that disruption would come swiftly if they misstepped. But Razor didn't target the weak indiscriminately, he targeted perception. One misaligned glance, one whispered joke, one questionable alliance, and an inmate could become his focus. The guards, already stretched thin, began noticing patterns that made their skin crawl. Razor seemed to know when cameras were blind, when officers were distracted, when a cell block's rhythm faltered. He didn't break rules, he anticipated them. One early morning count revealed an empty corridor that had been locked the night before. Razor had moved 3 blocks over without detection. Panic and paranoia spread through staff. How could one man bend a facility's logic to his will? Meanwhile, Razor wasn't content with just psychological dominance. He needed physical control. The yard became his stage. Other inmates, some intimidated, some allies, formed an unspoken perimeter around him. Razor walked with confidence, observing every interaction, reading every body language cue, testing obedience. Fights erupted only when they served his agenda. Others learned quickly. Stepping out of line wasn't just dangerous, it was catastrophic. The facility psychologist, Dr. Marlowe, was called in after a guard described Razor as beyond any conventional classification. She watched him during a recreation session, noting the precision with which he influenced others. Razor's charisma was subtle, manipulative, and terrifyingly effective. He could provoke fear without raising his voice, command respect without uttering a threat. Dr. Marlowe documented every pattern, every manipulation, realizing that Razor's psychological footprint might be stronger than any physical weapon he carried. But Razor's intelligence didn't stop there. Hidden in a maintenance closet previously overlooked, he had stashed tools, improvised weapons, and even maps of the prison layout. Investigators, when they discovered it, couldn't believe the level of foresight. This wasn't chaos for the sake of violence. It was organized, premeditated, and meticulously planned. Razor had built a mini-empire inside the penitentiary, a network of influence and intimidation that allowed him to operate with near impunity. That network extended beyond the walls. During restricted visitation hours, Razor leveraged allies among inmates' families and visitors, sending coded messages that further solidified loyalty and threatened dissenters. The system was no longer just an institution, it was a stage, and Razor controlled the narrative, manipulating fear both inside and outside the prison walls. Tension escalated when a new inmate, Marcus, the Bull, Benton, arrived. Known for his brute strength and explosive temper, Marcus had been transferred from a maximum security facility after multiple assaults. Razor recognized the threat immediately, and unlike most confrontations, he approached this with strategy rather than brute force. He tested Marcus, pushing him subtly with words, observing reactions, setting traps that gauged obedience and patience. One evening, in the dim light of the recreation hall, Marcus finally snapped. He lunged at another inmate who had allegedly insulted him, and Razor stepped in. But instead of attacking, Razor moved with the precision of a seasoned predator. Using Marcus's momentum, he redirected him into a wall, creating a spectacle that shocked witnesses. No guards had yet entered the hall, and by the time they did, Razor had already neutralized the threat, reasserted dominance, and sent a chilling message. The yard, the hierarchy, the power, Razor controlled it all. Even the warden began to feel the pressure. Reports arrived daily detailing subtle shifts in inmate behavior, coded messages, and unusual compliance patterns. Guards reported near misses, attacks that had been thwarted only because Razor chose to stop them. The administration realized that they were dealing with someone who didn't just survive in prison, he thrived on it. Meanwhile, investigators discovered a hidden ledger in Razor's cell. It contained names, affiliations, and potential targets. Some entries detailed alliances with violent inmates, others outlined debts owed or favors to be collected. This wasn't just a personal plan, It was a blueprint for control. Razor had transformed fear into a tool, and the realization made staff and inmates alike uneasy. The tension inside Unit 3 escalated further when an unexpected event occurred. A fire alarm triggered in the south wing. Chaos ensued as inmates evacuated. Razor, however, didn't panic. He maneuvered through corridors with deliberate purpose, observing reactions, ensuring no misalignment in loyalty, subtly asserting authority over both his allies and adversaries. By the time the guards restored order, Razor had reinforced his position, turning potential chaos into a demonstration of his dominance. One critical night, a confidential report reached the warden. Razor was suspected of planning an attack on another inmate as revenge for a perceived betrayal. The prison's emergency response protocol was activated. Guards were reassigned, cameras focused on corridors where Razor had been known to strike. But Razor, always anticipating, moved quietly, skillfully exploiting blind spots, showing once again that his influence wasn't just physical, it was psychological. During a routine inspection, a small group of guards discovered a secret communications network hidden within the cell block. Messages, hidden in laundry, food deliveries, and even in maintenance areas, revealed that Razor had orchestrated multiple alliances and coordinated movements. He had spies, loyalists, and informants within every section of the prison. The complexity and foresight were staggering. Razor's reach extended farther than anyone had imagined. The warden and investigators realized with growing horror, Razor wasn't just a violent inmate. He was a strategist, a manipulator, a living chess master whose pieces included the lives of every prisoner and the security of the entire facility. As night fell over the penitentiary, Razor's presence lingered like a phantom. Inmates whispered his name, guards double-checked locks, and the facility staff prepared for what would inevitably come next. Razor had transformed fear into a tool, and the power he wielded was now intangible, invisible, but absolute. And just when the staff thought they had him contained, a new discovery changed everything. Hidden in the ventilation shafts, investigators found notes and coded messages detailing plans that had yet to be executed, plans that could destabilize the entire prison. Razor's influence was far from neutralized. It was growing, evolving, and becoming more dangerous by the hour. The prison was quiet, almost eerily so, but the stillness carried its own weight. Razor's presence was everywhere, even when he wasn't in sight. The corridors, the cell blocks, the yard, every corner seemed to hold his shadow. Inmates whispered, guards moved cautiously, and the administration had long stopped pretending the facility could contain him without extraordinary measures. Razor had been planning his final move for months. Every fight, every alliance, every act of intimidation had been calculated, leading to this moment. It wasn't enough for him to merely dominate the prison physically. He wanted psychological control, absolute compliance. And now, with a perfect storm of fear, opportunity, and alliances, he was ready. It started with the yard. Inmates, loyal and intimidated alike, followed his subtle signals, forming a network of influence that stretched across the facility. When a fight broke out between two rival groups, Razor didn't intervene immediately. He circled, observing, measuring, and letting tension mount until the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. Then, with a single command barely audible, the chaos snapped into his favor. Allies moved strategically, controlling the yard, subduing potential threats, and enforcing Razor's unspoken hierarchy. In the control room, guards watched in disbelief. Cameras captured the unfolding events, but they weren't prepared for the precision with which Razor orchestrated the scene. It was as if the prison itself bent to his will. No alarms could truly contain him. Every tactic had been anticipated. Each lockdown or response plan became part of Razor's game, a step in a larger, invisible strategy. Meanwhile, the facility administration scrambled. The warden called emergency meetings, but Razor had already predicted their movements. He had spies, informants, and loyalists placed in key positions, including some staff who were unwittingly manipulated. Every action the prison took seemed to play into his hands. The very systems designed to restrain him were now part of his arsenal. One of Razor's most chilling maneuvers came during a night shift inspection. Alone in the darkness, he moved through the ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels he had meticulously mapped. No one noticed. No alarm sounded. By the time the guards realized a breach had occurred, Razor was already in a position of control, having isolated an entire section of inmates and bending them to his will without a single blow. Fear alone had won the battle. But Razor's psychological domination wasn't limited to overt threats. He planted seeds of doubt and paranoia among inmates, creating fractures in alliances. Friends turned against each other, and even the most loyal followers questioned their safety. Razor didn't just rely on intimidation. He used subtle manipulation, making each inmate complicit in their own subjugation. As the days progressed, incidents escalated. Minor disputes erupted into major confrontations orchestrated by Razor, each one reinforcing his control. Guards reported objects missing, weapons improvised, and coded messages found in impossible places. Razor was everywhere and nowhere at once, a phantom of fear whose influence could not be quantified. In the midst of this chaos, a young inmate named Leo, new to the facility, became an unexpected threat. Leo refused to bow to Razor's intimidation, speaking out against his dominance and questioning his authority. Razor recognized the challenge immediately. Unlike previous confrontations, this one required finesse. He cornered Leo in the recreation hall, not with violence, but with psychological precision. Subtle gestures, controlled movements, and a calm, predatory presence forced Leo into compliance. The lesson was clear. Defiance carried consequences, but Razor's real power lay in breaking spirits without leaving visible marks. Meanwhile, investigators reviewing prison footage uncovered a horrifying truth. Razor had mapped every potential weakness in the facility, anticipating responses and exploiting them. Emergency drills, lockdown protocols, and staff rotations had all been studied and turned against the institution. Razor was no longer just an inmate. He was a strategist operating a war within four walls. The climax approached during a facility-wide lockdown triggered by a minor altercation in Block D. Razor used the confusion to execute his most daring plan yet. He moved rapidly through service tunnels, coordinating allies in different blocks, isolating threats, and asserting dominance over the yard simultaneously. For hours, the prison teetered on the brink of complete chaos. Guards scrambled, alarms blared, and inmates either hid or followed his command. Razor's orchestration was flawless, an invisible web of control that no human force could fully counter. Then came the final confrontation. In the central corridor, where most of the key players converged, Razor faced off against a coalition of rival inmates and guards attempting to regain control. But Razor, anticipating every move, had already divided the space psychologically and physically. Allies positioned strategically, paths blocked subtly, and opponents funneled into areas of disadvantage. In seconds, the confrontation collapsed in Razor's favor. No one was injured fatally, but the message was unmistakable: Razor ruled. As investigators combed the facility afterward, they discovered a final shock. Hidden behind a maintenance panel, a cache of plans and notes outlining not only his internal control network but potential expansions beyond the prison walls. The implications were terrifying. Razor's influence could extend beyond this facility if left unchecked. He had mapped power, loyalty, and fear in a way that was almost surgical, and the traces remained even after the chaos subsided. By the end of the ordeal, the prison had been transformed. Inmates who had once resisted were compliant. Staff operated with constant caution, hyper-aware that any oversight could be exploited. Razor hadn't just survived the system, he had remade it in his image. Smash that subscribe button, hit like, and comment if you think you can handle the darkest corners of prison life.